Our historical sources can even lie and still be useful. There are two ways that someone can treat historical sources. You can treat historical sources as, or you can treat historical sources as.
When you are looking at history with
Mhm.
that type of lens that you have that is more open, how do you consider the bias that is naturally in the
In the
story? In
sources,
the
right.
sources, yeah.
All your sources are biased. So this is one thing. Anybody
Yeah.
who wants to do history is the first thing to realize is all your sources are biased, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes, okay, so the way that I approach this, I didn't read this book till later, but somehow as a teenager, I kind of got this idea. There's a book that I read when I was studying the history, doing the history major at BYU. It's called The Idea of History
Yeah.
by Robin Collingwood. So back in like the 40s or something, this philosopher of history, Robin Collingwood, he wrote kind of a history of how history has been done, how history has been understood. And in the back of the book, he's got these little epilogues about historical method and about historical sources. And he says there are two ways that someone can treat historical sources.
Yeah.
You can treat historical sources as authorities,
Mm.
or you can treat historical sources as evidence. And the
Mm.
difference here, he says
Hmm.
that good historians treat their sources as evidence. And he says not so good historians treat their sources as
Ah.
authorities. And so what he
Hmm.
says, and I love the way he lays it out, but like what he says is that for people who are taking the authority approach to historical sources, what they do is what he calls cut and paste history. So the idea there is, let's say that you have multiple accounts of the same historical event. Let's say that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and David Whitmer all gave an account of the same event from Kirtland.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then let's say their accounts differ in some ways;
Yeah.
they contradict in
Yeah.
some ways. So what he's saying is like the bad approach, the authority approach, um, is that someone will just compare the three sources and say, well, which of these sources is the most authoritative source?
Mm.
Which of them is the best authority on the subject? And so believing Latter-day Saints might say, well, it's obviously Joseph Smith because he's Joseph Smith, right?
Yeah.
Because he's the
Yeah. Yeah.
prophet. And
Yeah.
these others, well, they apostatize, so they can't be equally good sources to Joseph. Whereas someone who's maybe disaffected from the church might say,
Yeah.
well, maybe David Whitmer's the best source because he was the one who was really willing to like sort of stand up against the institution and so on, right? Um, but what Collingwood says is that what we should do, what good historians do, is treat their source. Oh, well, sorry. Let me say one more thing about the authority approach
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
sources. He calls it cut and paste history because what you do basically is once you've
Mm.
identified who gave the most authoritative account, you just basically like, you don't literally, but you almost like cut and paste their
Mm.
account into your book or whatever. And you say,
Yeah.
well, this is how it happened because this is what this guy said. And then for the next episode, you do the same thing. You figure out who's the best authority and you use their account. And so in that approach, you could just string together a bunch of quotes from historical sources
Yeah.
and say that's what happened, right?
Right.
Now, what Collingwood says we should do is we should treat our sources as evidence. So this means,
Mm.
on one level, you're open to all the sources, that they all might contribute something to understanding this event, but you don't swallow any of them completely.
Mm.
You don't just look at any of those sources and say, well, this guy said it, so he's 100% right about this. Because that's not the way historical sources work. If you actually look, that's not even the way eyewitness testimony works. There
Yeah.
are intense studies now on
Even after
eyewitness
the fact.
testimony,
Yeah.
and they show that
Yeah.
like if
Mm.
somebody came in here right now with a gun and like robbed us, right?
The
Like
memories.
and we gave a police report
Yeah.
and then we compared that to what was on camera. Like studies show that our reports would be wrong, even though we experienced it. We just
Yeah.
experienced
Yeah.
it. We might remember that the studies show that people will remember different hair color,
Mm.
different, like totally different height, different race of the perpetrator, just like all kinds of things. People will remember differently. That
Mm.
some people will remember that the criminal like said something, what they
Mm.
said, and some people remember they said something else, that they didn't say anything at all. So if that's the case with eyewitness testimony, just imagine when people are remembering historical events
Mm.
earlier, right?
And writing it.
Um, And so,
Interesting.
so basically what we have to do with the historical sources is, just like in that instance I was talking about with eyewitness testimony, we need to act as detectives.
Yeah.
So what we do, we don't just trust what any one account says and say, that's how it happened. We compare the different accounts, assuming that they all can potentially tell us something about it. Even if those
Mm.
sources contradict each other, they might contradict each other in a way that enables us to get a bigger picture. Kind of like
Mm.
if we're looking at this bottle from different angles, right, you're going to see things on it that I'm not,
Yeah.
right? And if somebody's over there, they're going to see something that we don't on it. Well, that's the way historical events are. And
Yeah.
so all the sources are valuable. They can all potentially tell us something. They all have biases. They all have an angle of vision.
Yeah.
But that's not a bad thing. That's a useful thing because you
I can
combine
see.
the different angles of vision and you get a fuller
Mm.
picture, right?
They give you perspective. It's almost like the contrast can give you more insight into the opposing idea.
Right.
Is that what you're saying? Meaning
That-
it's going to
yeah.
add to it at least, even if it's not the same thing.
Right. Exactly.
That's what you
Right.
mean, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's really interesting. But like I've heard a lot of people say before, like there's 3 sides to every story: side A, side B, and then the truth, right?
Right.
And so the recounting of history is different than what really actually happened. Meaning, like if I filmed it, you can see it, right? But my perspective, my perception, that's what can be different. That's what could be what's recorded, right?
Right. So this author, Robin Collingwood, he directly compares doing history to detective work. And he gives this
Mm.
great analogy. He comes up with this story. I think it's about a murder,
Yeah.
right? Like, man, this podcast is becoming so violent here. But
So what he said.
I think it's about a murder. And in this story, this detective goes and interviews all the different witnesses, and they all lie to him. Every one of them have their own reason for lying. But he's able to figure out from the pattern of their lies what actually happened, who actually did it. Because people don't lie. Even when people lie, they don't lie randomly.
Yeah.
People lie in order to get out of. People
For a
usually lie
reason.
out of self-interest. They have a particular angle, right? And so
Interesting.
our historical sources can even lie and still be useful to
Interesting.
us. And so in my perspective, we don't throw out historical sources. We just use them for whatever they turn out to be good for. We use them as detectives.